We all know the image. It's practically etched into our collective cultural memory. 9 companions standing on a rocky outcrop, resolving to walk into the shadow. The Fellowship of the Ring. A hobbit, a dwarf, an elf, 2 men, a wizard, and 3 more hobbits, bound by a singular, impossible purpose. It's a moment of profound hope against overwhelming darkness. It's a promise that unity, in all its unlikely forms, is the only real weapon against despair. We know this story, we love this story. But here's the thing nobody talks about. That fellowship, that iconic band of heroes you know, almost didn't exist. Not in that form, not with that hope. In the earliest drafts of The Lord of the Rings, buried deep within the archives of J.R.R. Tolkien's private papers, lies a different path, a darker road. He sketched a version of events so grim, so suffused with failure and betrayal, that he eventually abandoned it, burying it under layers of revision until the story we know today finally emerged into the light. What we're about to uncover changes everything we think we know about the heart of this story. It's not just a collection of deleted scenes or alternate character names. It's a glimpse into a fundamentally different tale, one that asks a much more terrifying question. It's not, can good triumph over evil, but rather, can goodness even survive itself? What if the greatest threat to the Fellowship wasn't the orcs of Mordor, but the darkness they carried within their own hearts? To understand the weight of what was lost, we first have to appreciate the delicate miracle of what we were given. The Council of Elrond, as it exists in the final published text, is a masterpiece of narrative construction. It's a gathering of free peoples, each with their own ancient grievances, their own deep-seated prejudices. Dwarves who distrust elves, men of Gondor who look down on the scattered rangers of the north. Everyone, to some degree, viewing hobbits as a quaint, insignificant folk. And yet, in that council, something extraordinary happens. The weight of the world's peril forces them to look past their differences. Elrond's wisdom, Gandalf's urgency, and Frodo's simple, devastating courage forge a new bond. The Fellowship is born not from a strategic alliance, but from a series of individual, voluntary acts of love and loyalty. Gimli, son of Glóin, steps forward for the dwarves, his ancestral grudge against elves momentarily forgotten. Legolas joins for the elves, a silent promise of solidarity. Boromir for the pride and desperation of Gondor. Aragorn for the hope of a restored kingdom and his love for Arwen. And of course, Sam, Merry and Pippin, who join not for any grand political reason, but out of simple, unbreakable friendship. This is the core of Tolkien's thesis. The ring can only be destroyed by a coalition of the small and the great, the wise and the simple, all bound by a trust that transcends history. The evil of Sauron is monolithic, a singular will imposing its order on the world. The good, in response, must be pluralistic, a voluntary union of free peoples. This is the story we received. It is a story about the power of community to withstand the forces of dissolution. It is, at its heart, a story of hope. But in the early 1940s, as the shadow of a very real war was falling across Europe, Tolkien was struggling with a different kind of story. As he drafted the chapters following the Council of Elrond, the fellowship he created was far from the noble band we know. It was a tense, fractured, and deeply suspicious group from the very beginning. We can see the seeds of this in the final text, of course. The bickering between Legolas and Gimli, Boromir's obvious pride and desire for the ring. But in the drafts, these are not minor tensions to be overcome. They are deep, structural cracks threatening to shatter the quest before it even truly begins. Christopher Tolkien, in his monumental work, The History of Middle-earth, pulls back the curtain on this process. He shows us a version where Boromir is not just tempted, but is openly hostile and cynical towards Aragorn almost immediately. He sees Aragorn not as the returning king, but as a rival, a wild-eyed ranger making a play for his father's stewardship. The conflict between them is not a subtle undercurrent. It is the central drama of the early journey. In one abandoned note, Tolkien considered having Boromir actively try to lead the company to Minas Tirith, not as a suggestion, but as a demand, creating a schism that forces Gandalf to exert his authority in a much more severe and divisive way. The journey through Moria, in this version, is less a shared tragedy and more a breaking point for an already failing enterprise. The unity is a facade. The hope is a lie. And why does this matter? Why is a more conflicted fellowship so significant? Because it fundamentally changes the nature of the story's central conflict. In the book we have, the primary antagonist is external, Sauron and his vast armies. The world is threatened from the outside, and the heroes must band together to face it. The internal struggles, Frodo's burden, Boromir's temptation, are tragic and vital, but they exist in service to the larger fight. But in this abandoned draft, the conflict is inverted. The greatest enemy is internal. It is the pride of men, the suspicion of dwarves, the fallibility of the heroes themselves. The quest is threatened not by the Balrog in Moria, but by the moral rot within the Fellowship. Sauron almost becomes a secondary concern, a distant threat compared to the immediate danger of self-destruction. This reframes the entire narrative. It's no longer a story about a united good fighting a monolithic evil. It becomes a story about whether the concept of good can even hold itself together under pressure. Can a fellowship, any fellowship, survive the inherent flaws of its members? The ring's influence in this version is not just a corrupting force acting upon individuals. It's an accelerant, a catalyst that exposes the pre-existing weaknesses and resentments that were there all along. It doesn't create the cracks, it just pries them open until the whole structure collapses. This is a much bleaker, more cynical worldview. It suggests that even without Sauron, the races of Middle-earth might be doomed to fail, forever crippled by their own pride and prejudice. Let's allow ourselves to imagine, just for a moment, what that story would have felt like. Picture the scene at the Pass of Caradhras. In the final version, it's a battle against the cruelty of the mountain, a test of their collective endurance. Boromir argues for the Gap of Rohan, Aragorn for Moria, but they are a council, debating as equals. Now, imagine the darker version. The snow whips around them, but the real storm is between the two men. Boromir, his voice sharp with scorn, openly questions Aragorn's leadership. "You would lead us through the goblin halls of the dwarves, Ranger? You who have lived in the wild like a wolf? I serve the Lord of Gondor, not a vagrant with an old sword." Aragorn, weary and burdened, clenches his fist, the ring of Barahir glinting in the cold light. Gandalf steps between them, his staff held not as a source of light, but as a barrier. "There is only one path that serves the quest," he intones, but his voice lacks its usual warmth. It is the command of a general, not the guidance of a friend. The hobbits huddle together, not just from the cold, but from the raw animosity radiating from the tall folk. Sam looks at Frodo, his eyes wide with a fear that has nothing to do with orcs. The fear is that the company is already broken. Later, in Moria, after Gandalf falls, this version becomes even more grim. Aragorn's claim to leadership is tenuous, contested. Boromir sees not a tragedy, but an opportunity. He might not even try to take the ring from Frodo by force at Amon Hen. Instead, he might try to win over Merry and Pippin with promises of glory in the armies of Gondor, splitting the company politically. The breaking of the fellowship would not be a tragic accident of an orc attack, but a calculated act of internal betrayal. Frodo and Sam wouldn't slip away in secret to preserve the quest. They would flee in terror from their own companions. This isn't an adventure story anymore. It's a political thriller wrapped in a tragedy. It's a story about the collapse of an alliance, where the ring is less a magical artifact and more a perfect metaphor for the corrupting nature of power itself. This darker, more political story feels, in many ways, more modern. It feels more aligned with the grim fantasies of the 21st century, where moral ambiguity reigns and heroes are deeply, often irreparably, flawed. So why did Tolkien pull back? Why did he abandon this path of cynicism and political failure for the one we know, the one of hope and enduring loyalty? The answer, I think, lies in the man himself and the world he had endured. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was a veteran of the Battle of the Somme, one of the bloodiest and most senseless slaughters in human history. He had seen friendships forged in the crucible of training, only to be extinguished in an instant by the impersonal horror of machine guns and artillery. He knew in his bones what it was like to see a fellowship of men torn apart. He had lived through the collapse of ideals, the bitter reality that courage and camaraderie were often not enough. That darker draft, the one filled with internal strife and the failure of good intentions, was not a failure of imagination. It was a reflection of reality. It was the story the Great War had taught him to write. It was a story born of trauma, a narrative steeped in the mud and disillusionment of the trenches. In that version, the fellowship is not a symbol of hope. It is a microcosm of a fallen world, a world where alliances are temporary, trust is a commodity, and every man is ultimately out for himself. The ring's victory would be assured not by its own power, but because its enemies would inevitably destroy each other first. This is the ultimate nihilism. It's a statement that evil doesn't need to be strong. It just needs to be patient and wait for the good to cannibalize itself. The story was heading towards a precipice, a world where the quest fails not because the enemy was too strong, but because the heroes were too weak. Not physically weak, but morally and spiritually weak. The breaking of the fellowship at Amon Hen, in this abandoned timeline, would have been the story's true climax. Everything after would be a long, drawn-out epilogue of failure. Frodo and Sam, alone and abandoned, marching towards Mordor, not with the memory of a noble company to sustain them, but with the bitter ashes of betrayal in their mouths. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli's journey would not be a heroic pursuit to save their friends, but a desperate attempt to hold together the tatters of a failed alliance, constantly looking over their shoulders, perhaps even suspecting each other. The very soul of the narrative changes. The theme is no longer about hope against all odds. The theme is about the inevitability of decay. It is a profoundly pessimistic story, and Tolkien, a man of deep Catholic faith and a fundamentally hopeful disposition, stood at this narrative crossroads and made a choice. He looked at the bleak, realistic, war-scarred story he was writing, a story that reflected the horrors he had witnessed, and he deliberately turned away. He chose to write a different story, not because it was easier, but because he believed it was truer. This is the core insight. The revelation isn't just that an early draft was darker. The revelation is in the act of revision itself. Tolkien's decision to rewrite the Fellowship, to transform them from a bickering, suspicious cabal into a band of flawed but ultimately loyal brothers, was a profound act of philosophical defiance. He was not writing a history of the world he knew. He was writing a myth for the world he believed was possible. He rejected the cynicism of his age. He rejected the easy narrative of inevitable failure. He chose, consciously and deliberately, to write a story about hope. He made the Fellowship work. He made their loyalty stronger than their prejudice. He made their love for each other the very engine that would carry the quest forward. This pivot is the most important creative decision in the entire legendarium. He didn't ignore the darkness. He acknowledges it in Boromir's fall, in the arguments, in the moments of doubt. But he refused to let the darkness win the internal battle. He insisted, on the page, that goodness, loyalty, and simple friendship are not naive ideals, but are in fact the most powerful and resilient forces in the universe. The final version of The Lord of the Rings is not a fantasy that escapes reality. It is a fantasy that argues with reality. It looks at the despair of the 20th century and says, no, there is another way. And in this act of rewriting, Tolkien himself becomes the overlooked hero of his own story. Not as a character, but as the creator. Think of the courage that takes to have lived through the worst of humanity, to have all the evidence you need to believe in the futility of goodness, and yet to spend decades of your life painstakingly building a world that argues for the opposite. That is an act of profound hope. It connects to a truth we all experience. We all live in a world that constantly presents us with evidence for cynicism. We see betrayal, division, the failure of our institutions, and sometimes the failure of our own hearts. It is easy, perhaps even logical, to conclude that everything is broken beyond repair. We all have a dark draft of our own lives, a story we can tell ourselves where hope is foolish and trust is a mistake. Tolkien's journey as a writer is a map for how to contend with that. He didn't pretend the darkness wasn't there. He wrote it down. He stared it in the face. He explored its every bleak conclusion. And then he made the choice to build something better in its place. He reminds us that hope is not a passive feeling. It is an active choice. It is a thing you build, a story you choose to tell, even when, especially when, the world gives you every reason to tell a different one. The story we almost got was a reflection of the world's brokenness. The story we have is a tool for healing it. It is a reminder that the bonds of fellowship, though fragile, are worth fighting for, both in Middle-earth and in our own lives. So, when we look at that iconic image of the 9 companions now, we should see something more. We should not see an inevitable band of heroes destined for glory. We should see a fragile miracle. We should see a choice made, a darker path deliberately and painstakingly unwritten. The fellowship we know is not a given, it is a victory. It is the product of an author's refusal to surrender to the despair of his own experience. The story of its creation is as powerful as the story itself. It is a testament to the idea that the tales we tell matter. They don't just reflect the world, they shape it. They can reinforce our cynicism, or they can arm us with hope. Tolkien could have given us a grim, cautionary tale about the futility of unity. Instead, he gave us a myth that has inspired millions to believe in it. He knew the road was dark. He had walked it. But he chose to light a star, Arendil's star, to hang in the terrifying sky. He chose to believe that even in the deepest shadow, the bonds of love and friendship could provide a light and a way through. What does it mean that the story we love was almost something else entirely? It means that hope is never an accident. It is a deliberate, courageous, and often difficult act of creation. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all. The fellowship you know didn't just happen. It was chosen. It was built. It was saved, not by a wizard or a king, but by its own author who believed, against all evidence, that it was worth saving. And in doing so, he gave us a story that might just help us save our own.